What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? It's the one and only James Williams, Dog Waters, and I'm back with another phenomenal interview. Now, before we get into this interview, let me pause right here and let me say this. And I'm going to be 100% honest with you, ladies and gentlemen. The whole werewolf thing that has invaded the cryptid community, I think we need to slow down and we need to do some reevaluation of it and see what's going on with it. Now, we know that in the cryptid community, the legend of Dogman has been there for a long time. And I'm not sure if Dogman spun off the werewolf theory or if the werewolf spun off Dogman. I know that there's evidence that both of them have been around a very long time. But tonight, my guest, Charles Christian, and I are going to dig into the theories of where werewolves come from and some of the folklore history on it, and we get so caught up in encounters that we don't really touch on the folklore. And the folklore, to me, is where the answers to questions are, and it's a combination of that folklore with the person's real-life encounter where you get to the truth of things. So that's what we're doing tonight. I'm hoping you guys are going to enjoy it. Pause, strike that, rewind. I know you guys are going to enjoy it because this is what we do. And without any further ado, Charles Christian, sir, how are you today? And thank you for joining us over here in the Dog Waters.
I'm fine, and thank you for inviting me, James. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Nope, it's a pleasure to have you. Let's start here. Before in the pre-interview, we talked about your background and your history. And I want you to talk to the audience a little bit about what you did as a profession and then how you transitioned over into being into the whole weird world of weirdness and crazy, because I think it's very interesting. Your background is extensive. So take a moment, tell everybody about yourself and how you got to this point.
Right. Well, I started out in my, I suppose, professional career as an English barrister. Those are the guys who wear the wigs and the gowns in the courts that you see on the movies. And then I moved into journalism. I was a Reuters correspondent, and then I became an editor. I wrote a few books. I became a technology journalist. And basically, I've been earning my living now for a very long time by writing about one thing or another. A lot of the day job writing was very much technical stuff, legal stuff, technology and the likes. But I've always had this interest in folklore, the weird and the strange. And I think that comes from my childhood, that I picked up the vibes. But when you grow up, if you like, and you've got to earn a living for yourself, when I was starting out, the whole paranormal scene, certainly in the UK, was non-existent, and there was just nothing going, and I didn't particularly fancy being an academic studying folklore at a university. So I went off into other elements of journalism. And then slightly later in life, when the pressures of the day job started to decline, I was able to go back to my original interests, and I started researching stories and I started writing books. And I've written a number of books, and I've got several more in the pipeline in one stage or another. And they're all broadly on folklore, legends, ghost stories, weird tales. All of them slightly blur with each other, if you like, where history and legends and folklore, they're all really different aspects of the same subject. Some you can prove and you've got clinical evidence, you've got scientific evidence, others you can't, but there's enough information from other people to substantiate it. And then going way back in time into the realms of legend, you've really only got tales that have been handed down for generations and generations.
I want to go back to something you said, Charles, if you don't mind. Take me back to your childhood. Did you have a childhood where you were having paranormal encounters and experiences, or were you just interested in this subject as a child?
As a child, I suppose I I think there were paranormal things going on, but I was, as is often the way with when you're a child, um, I didn't really recognize them, and I didn't really recognize what was going on. I say in my biography, I lived in basically a haunted house by the um, harbour side in a little town called Scarborough in the north of England. And we were right on the edge of the water there, so much so that if there was a particular strong high tide, which you get in spring and autumn, our cellars would flood. We were that close. And it was one of those houses that was originally medieval, and then bits had been built on it. You know, the original parts go back to the 1200s about, and then bits were added on and added on over the generations. So the house was a complete strange mishmash, um, with corridors that led nowhere, with rooms hidden behind panels, with boarded up areas. It was generally a spooky atmosphere. And one of my mother's friends, who was a claimed to be psychic, she said that whenever she came into the house, she could hear the sound of large, heavy boots clumping around on the ceilings. And we realized that going back in time, my great grandmother had used to allow, because it was a seaport town, fishermen and men from ships, sailors who were caught in the port in a storm. She'd let them sleep up in the attic space, in the attic rooms, and they all wore heavy, big, thigh high boots, which obviously clumped around. So we had that element. And there was also a strange thing where when I'd be asleep in bed, there'd be this sensation that somebody or something was tugging the bottom of the bed. It's one of those beds, single child bed, where there's a bedboard at the very bottom. And it was as if somebody was just grabbing hold of it and giving it a tug backwards and forwards. And I obviously asked my parents and said, you know, is there something happening? And they just said, oh, it's the wind hitting the house. And being a child, I accepted that. And it was only many, many years later when we were actually closing up the house and my parents had moved away and the house was up for sale. It was only then clearing it out that I realized that if the wind had hit the house, it couldn't possibly have shaken the bed the way it did because of the difference of the angles of prevailing winds. So there was clearly something going on there, but I rather missed it. So I think it's one of those things that there was stuff going around, but in my childhood innocence, if you like, I missed the clues, as you often do with a kid. You know, you don't think those things. But I say the whole family were ones for telling tales about mystic experiences that they'd had and ghosts that various of their relatives have had. And we were of a generation, say, especially when I was a kid growing up in the 1950s, at Christmas and times like that in the winter, the family would sit around the fireplace and we'd exchange stories, and people would tell ghost stories and things that had happened to them. So I grew up in this atmosphere where it was accepted that ghosts and things that go bump in the night really existed. But oblivious to it all, they all passed me by. Opportunities missed.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting because when you go back, and you look into the people who are actually personalities in the paranormal field, right? Every last one of them has had some kind of paranormal experience as a child. And it's this process of seeking answers that lead people to the point where either they're an audience member where they're listening to this, and then you combine that seeking for answers with their professional or their trade. If when those two combine, then you get kind of these people who become powerhouses in the paranormal community. Um, and I just think it's interesting. That's why I always like to ask guests like you know, how did this start? But I don't want to do the traditional. Well, how did you get into this? I really want to know what happened to people as a kid because it explains how they are as an adult. I really do. All right. With that being said, we got that out of the way, and I want to talk about some werewolves, right? So,
Right.
we were talking as I opened up the show, talking about what Dogman, which is purely a werewolf-like being. It could be black, it could be gray, it could look like a hyena. It's like this all-encompassing terminology for a upright walking canine wolf that primarily lives all over the world. But it's not a human being that transforms into a wolf. It's 24/7 a wolf. According to witnesses, and I've talked to a lot of witnesses to the point where I know it's real. There's no longer a doubt as to whether or not it's real or not. I want to draw a distinct line between those two legends, the legend of Dogman and the legend of werewolves, if that's possible. And can you walk me through some of your research on werewolves and like an origin of them? Does your research go back to the whole Romulus myth, or where does your research start off when we start talking about werewolves?
Well, my interest, I mean, there's legends of werewolves and skinwalkers that you can find in the Native American population, but also across Europe. And it's a fairly well-established concept. The Japanese have a similar thing, not necessarily with wolves, because it's not one of their creatures, but with other animals, people who can turn into foxes and so on. So it's a fairly constant theme in folklore going back thousands of years that some people at certain times of the year and in certain circumstances can transform from a human being into a wolf. And a werewolf basically means a man wolf. My own interest stemmed actually from a story I heard when I was a kid, and obviously as a teenager, I was still fascinated with the paranormal, if you like, and I was still reading up about it and still, visiting haunted houses and looking around places that were spooky, if you like. And there was a tale from about 10 miles away from where I lived in a small village, and it was of a creature in the Middle Ages called Old Stinker, known as Old Stinker because it apparently had very putrid breath. And Old Stinker was said to be a werewolf that was a man by day and then at night would transform into a wolf and would attack travelers going along the lonely roads in that part of the world. Indeed, the suggestion was the wolf, when it was a man, would lurk in marketways and inns and learn who was going to be traveling on the road that particular day and what they'd have with them. And then, in the form of the guise of a wolf, it would descend upon these people, accompanied by a wolf pack of real wolves, and they would attack, kill, eat the people that had been picked out. Now, it's intriguing because, obviously it was local, so it was the werewolf of Folkestone, and it was a particular fascinating piece of information from where I was living. But it was also intriguing because werewolves aren't really part of English folklore. There's been some talk of them in the late 20th century, but that was very much more into the internet age. And prior to that, there's nothing much at all about werewolves in English folklore except Old Stinker. And Old Stinker's talked about existing about 1,000 years ago, and then there's reports of him being seen again throughout the centuries, and accounts of people driving in coaches, and say when I was a teenager, even a report of a lorry driver traveling along there in his truck, and this large wolf-like creature with bright red eyes leaping up at the cab that he was in, but he was able to drive away and escape. So that was, if you like, where my interest was piqued. And I wrote about it in a book of mine that came out in 2015 called A Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolves. And that got a lot of newspaper coverage locally. And a few months later, there were reports in a nearby city called Hull that Old Stinker was walking again. And it was known as the Beast of Barmston Drain, which is a small canal. And for about a period of about 3 months over the winter of that 2015, 2016, there were multiple claims of sightings of a large wolf-like creature prowling around the slums and dark areas of this town, the old industrial areas that are now sort of derelict. And because I'd written a book about it, I got asked by a national newspaper to go on a werewolf hunt. And just to add to it, it was on the night of a full moon. And lo and behold,
That's
I went
cool.
on a werewolf hunt.
That is cool, bro. That is so cool. That is so cool.
So I've got werewolf hunter on my CV now.
And so, how did it go? Because I don't know if I would have went. I might have went with you. I don't know. When it comes to these things, I know they're real, so I kind of freak out. How did it go? You got to tell me how this went when you went out there.
Well, I have to say, I thought it was highly unlikely that a werewolf had come back after 1,000 years. And I suspected what we were more likely to encounter would be a large feral dog, one that's run wild, or a large dog that had got too vicious and had been let loose. And there was plenty of places in that particular area for them to scavenge and to, other creatures that could live on, cats, smaller dogs, the like. So I was very much of the view that we weren't going to meet one, and I did take the precaution. I did assume that we might meet a very large, fierce dog, so I did take the precaution of taking a very stout walking stick with a big metallic club on one end and a spike on the other for dealing with it. But I say I was of the view it was unlikely to be a real werewolf because it's a fairly big ask to transform a human into a werewolf. You know, the DNA is different. Everything is different. They have different number of ribs to us. Their jaws are different. They've got different numbers of teeth. It's a huge transformation if it's going to be physical. So I think, confident that we wouldn't meet a real werewolf, but we might encounter a fierce dog. And as I say, we set off at midnight. We started off because it was being sponsored by a newspaper with a photo shoot in a graveyard, standing around a few tombs in the gloom. And we headed off down this very spooky track by the side of this, it's called a drain, but I say it's a small canal, and has a bad reputation because it's got very steep banks, and over the years lots of people have fallen in or jumped in and drowned. the whole area has still got pollution around it, so there's a sort of a thick fog coming off it. And we went along there, and there was definitely signs that something large had been running through the undergrowth and crushing down vegetation where it had been going. And then at the other side of this drain, I had a spotlight with me, and I saw something move, and I put the spotlight on it and caught the sight of a pair of eyes staring back at me. And they were orangey red, just like the legend has it. And you could tell by the size and the distance between them that it was a big animal. You know, it was not a fox or anything like that. And most, I suppose, disconcerting was that instead of, as often if you do that with an animal, it will just duck for cover and run away and hide. This actually stared back and proceeded to track us on the opposite side of the river. So we were walking in one direction, and it was following us on the opposite side, watching us as we went. And that was quite a scary moment for all of us there, because we thought, have we really discovered a werewolf? And fortunately, say there was a river with a steep bank between us and no bridges. So eventually the creature wandered off and we didn't see it again. So I think it's a case of I might have met a werewolf, but it didn't get me. But I say it was quite a spooky end to the evening. And after that, interest waned, and the story, became a bit of a 5-minute wonder and a bit of an internet sensation for a few months, but then died off, and nothing more has been heard of it in the 8 years plus 6 years that have elapsed since that sighting. But I say that was my encounter with it. But I say when I went into it, I had done some research on the whole topic, and it's intriguing because the idea of the shape-shifting werewolf, most of what we call werewolf lore, the thing that if you shoot a werewolf with a silver bullet, it'll kill the wolf, and as it dies, it transforms back into the human that it used to be, which is, a well-known theme in movies. That actually seems to have been the invention of Hollywood scriptwriters in the 1930s with a couple of Lon Chaney movies, the Werewolf of London and the Wolfman. And it seems to have somehow got set in the mindset, a bit like people now regard Slender Man as a real phenomenon, but that started out 20 years ago as a competition, an online competition to create a scary monster. And I do wonder whether the werewolf, as we know it in popular legend, is actually something of that nature. But say then there's another interesting part to the story, because going back in ancient history, going back to the original Old Stinker the Werewolf about 1,000 years ago, the area where it was seen was known to be plagued by wolves. And there was even a hostel built on one of the roads, a charitable hostel set up purely to protect travelers so that they could have shelter at night, and in the words of the charter that set it up, and not be eaten by wolves. So there was a problem with wolves, and wolves do horrible things. They are scavengers, and so in winter they would have come off the hills and down into the valley where this hostel was, and they would have done things like excavated newly buried bodies from churchyards, and that all gives to the unholy aspect of them. But what I find the most interesting thing is in the year 1066, which is a big date in English history, shortly before the Normans came over and the Norman conquest and William the Conqueror and all that, there was the last invasion of England by the Vikings, and they landed in the town of Scarborough, which, say where I grew up, landed there, and some of them sailed around the coast, but another part of them marched as an army down across the countryside, killing anybody they encountered. Now, as anybody who's watched the Vikings and other series on TVs will know, there's a type of Viking known as a berserker who would get themselves high on alcohol and hallucinogenic mushrooms, drugs, and they would be psyched up for war. They would go into battle wielding axes and swords, and they'd often not wear any armor, but they would be clad in a bearskin. That's why the name berserker comes from, and they'd have a big bearskin slung over their back and the head part over their head, and they were regarded, they terrified anybody they met because they were just fighting machines. And this army was led by a well-known Viking berserker. But along with the berserkers who wore the bearskins, there were also warriors who wore wolf skins. So I'm wondering whether the tale of old Stinker is a bit of a confabulation between the fact there were real wolves in the area attacking people, and that at one particular point, a Viking army marched through there with men splattered in blood, bare-chested but wrapped in wolf skins. And if you imagine you're a Saxon peasant, terrified for your life, hiding in a barn somewhere while this scary army goes past, you would see these creatures and you'd be thinking, is that a man? Is it a wolf? Is it a man-wolf? Is it a werewolf? Which is where the name comes from. So I think, as with a lot of folklore, the tale has a origin in truth and fact, but over the years, the tale has become embellished and has become a lot more exotic. And so instead of it just being Viking warriors wearing bearskins and carrying swords, suddenly they become werewolves, and then it becomes Werewolf, the tale of old Stinker. And, the legend has a point in history where it began, and still to this day continues.
Well, there's also the element of, earlier you mentioned skinwalkers from the Native American lore and legend. Also, the berserkers, when you go back and do, and I'm pretty sure you've done some research, when you go back and look at the gods of Odin that were worshipped, and you look at their version of magic practitioners in Viking lore, I can't remember the exact name of what they called them. There were actually people within those circles of their magic practitioners, which practice magic of the earth, that got to a point to where they were equivalent of a skinwalker in the Native American tradition, where it was believed that that person had gained and mastered the ability to actually transform their body into a particular animal. I always thought that, the transition from a man, like your arms and legs stretching and your ribs twisting, and I always felt that that was impossible, but maybe there's some other way that they transform, or maybe there's some other form of projection that they use that allows them to accomplish this. For example, I know L.A. Marzulli talked about, if you may know, it wasn't L.A. Marzulli, it was one of these guys that came from the Church of Satan and converted to Christianity. He talked about how at the very, very high levels of Luciferian doctrine and the practitioners that they get to a point to where they can make a choice. And he was really, really deep involved in it. I'm looking at his face, but I can't remember his name. And he said, you get to a point where you make a choice where you can actually choose a shape shifting ability. And you can transform into a bird and you can transform into a wolf. And you can do these different things. But most people didn't go that route because it was a very painful thing. And I think he actually wrote about it. Had you run into anything from a magical perspective or maybe a ritual sacrifice perspective? That
No, no, I haven't. I must admit, I haven't on that. I mean, there is a long tradition of shamanism, which the Vikings certainly have, which the Sami folk up in Finland and Lapland still have to this day, in which some of the tribal people in Asia have, and again, equivalent in North America, of people who, through their rituals, certainly believe that they have either transformed into the creature that they are following, wanting to copy, imagining that they are, or that they've somehow put their mind into an actual creature so that they aren't actually flying as a bird because they've turned into a bird and to an eagle. Their mind is controlling that eagle, and that they are flying through the skies and looking through the eagle's eyes. If you like, they've possessed that creature. And that, I think, is an alternative perspective, which completely avoids the biological, physiological issues that you, if you like, you imagine yourself into being one of those. And certainly, shamanism very much has that the person genuinely believes they've become that creature, or they've become one with the creature that they're interested in for knowledge, or to pick up their wisdom, or just to understand them better.
Thank you so much for articulating that way better than I was, because that's what I was the point I was trying to get at, and you hit the nail right on the head. Um, I do. I'm with you. I think it's very, very hard for. It would be extremely difficult for a human being to transform into some other creature. And after talking to, I think it's been like 2,300 witnesses on various different cryptid topics. I've yet to talk to one who said they saw a man change into anything. I've talked
Mm.
to people in the Native American tribes who told me the legends of skinwalkers and how they got started, and those are the legends, like some of their distinct legends that they don't share with people. But I've yet to
Yeah.
talk to one who said, "Oh yeah, 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 my cousin Billy over there, he transformed into a werewolf, and I saw his arms and his legs stretch. I just haven't seen it, but it's something that's prevalent in this community." Um, and so I
Yeah.
really wanted to have that discussion and hear it from your perspective, because I know you do your research and you research the
Mm.
folklore. Now,
Yeah.
let's touch on when we were talking about these stories. What books are these coming from? Because I know you've written these books. Where can they find some of this information? Where should my audience be
Right. Well,
looking?
the werewolves. I've now updated my original book, and I've got a new book out called "The Mysterious Wold Newton Triangle." Wold is WOLD, Newton is Newton, and triangle is triangle. And its subtitle is "Wraiths, Werewolves, and Other Weird Tales from the Yorkshire Wolds," and that is now available on Amazon, both in print and as a Kindle, and that's newly out and available both on Amazon.com and elsewhere. So that really encapsulates most of the my werewolf stories and some related shamanism stories, because there's archaeological evidence of shamanism going back thousands of years, with the discovery of the parts of red deer skulls that had been carved with eye holes, and the belief is that the hunters of that time, and the red deer in the United Kingdom was the equivalent of the um, North American bison in Native American cultures, as it was the source of so many things: food, skins for clothing, sinews for strings, bones for carving into spearheads and the like. And it's thought the fact that there were so many of these skulls called frontlets found in one place, that again, the hunters must have warned them and somehow felt that they were becoming as one with the red deer and could blend in with them and could understand what they were going to do, and that they were better prepared to hunt them. So I say it's all of those tales you can find in the book, The Mysterious Wold Newton Triangle.
Now I gotta ask you a question. You said wraith,
Yeah,
Wrath. What is a wraith? Is that the equivalent of a ghost? What is it?
it is a ghost. It's just another name for a ghost. The reason I did it, which is a bit corny, but it was wraiths, werewolves, and other weird tales. So I was going for the alliteration.
I got you. I got you. I just want to make sure I
Yeah,
understood what it was.
for the artistic effect. Yes, just for the artistic effect.
All right, so this book goes into ghosts, werewolves, and other weird tales. When you go down the road of weird tales, what kind of tales are we talking about when we get into the weird?
Well, when I talk about the weird, I mean tales that are just strange and unusual, and are, for that reason, I find intriguing. I mean, we all know about ghosts and things, what they are. Um, but there's just lots of odd stories, and this is what drew me to this area. That the more I looked into it, the more odd stories I found, and I just found it, a fascinating area. Uh, you know, there's some ancient. This area I'm talking about, the Yorkshire Wolds. Um, it's built on limestone, and it seems to have been an area of a sort of a ritual landscape, sacred landscape, for thousands of years. There's a big stone monolith or megalith there. Right now, it's right next to a Christian church that's only about 1,000 years old. But this stone has been there for 4,000 years, and when it went into the ground, it still is taller than the tallest stones in in Stonehenge. It is enormous. I just felt it needed a bit of a mention. And say there's lots of burial mounds, sometimes called barrows, and they are dozens of them in the area. A lot of them have been destroyed or flattened by farming over the thousands of years that they've been there. But there are still the stumps of some very large ones, and the excavations have found that they were the burial sites of people of high net worth, from things that have been found in them. And then they've all become wrapped up with tales that that's where the fae or fairies now live. And there's again tales going back hundreds of years of people having encounters with the fae when they've been walking past these barrows. And there's one site that's recently being excavated, where it was a chariot that was buried along with the two horses that had been pulling it and the owner of it. And the only sense the archaeology is that when it was originally buried in the ground, the top halves of the horses were still above ground. So it looked like this chariot was bursting out of the ground, which must have been particularly scary for anybody traveling around there. And there's a churchyard there. It's called a deserted medieval village, and there's a lot of them. Those in England where enclosure, the changes in farming, they've been abandoned, or the Black Death wiped out the population and they were no longer viable. And it's subject of an archaeological dig for best part of 40 years. Every season, every summer season, they dig there. And they were digging through the remains buried in the churchyard, and these were medieval remains. And they found that a number of the bodies there had been ritually mutilated. Their legs had been cut off at the knee, their heads had been cut off, and in some instances placed between their legs or placed face downwards. And this reflects a medieval fear of the walking dead, that the dead would come back. They used to call them revenants. We'd call them either zombies, or in some towns they actually sound more like vampires. But these, it was a genuine fear that the dead would come back, the unhappy dead would come back and walk. And so, to the people of the time, the simplest way to stop a body walking was to do things to it so it couldn't walk. So you chop off its legs and you chop off its head. So even if it did walk, it wouldn't know where it was going. And it's just fascinating that this is, again, it's in this area called the Wald-Newton Triangle. And it's one of the few, if not the only, well excavated site where this has been found in the whole country. So again, it's this, it's an epicenter of weirdness and strangeness.
Modern times, are people still experiencing, outside of seeing the fae or the fairies? What other things are people in that area or frequent that area? What other things are they experiencing? I would love to hear one of the tales of something that somebody more recently saw. Do you have any of that in the book?
Well, yes. I mean, we do talk about UFOs, and there's been a lot of UFO sightings around this area. Again, it's a bit hard to work out what's true and what's not true, because there are some, there's a big radar station there, and they do have lots of low-flying aircraft and high-flying aircraft and experimental aircraft flying over it. Not quite an Area 51, but there is a lot of activity there. But there's still a lot of UFO sightings. And one of the things people say is because there are a number of ley lines running through this area. And one of the biggest in the country that runs all the way down from the west of England, slices all its way up, stops at this monolith that I mentioned earlier, that's by this little church, this little village called Rudston. And it goes there, and then there's another branch of it that goes up into the northwest of England, and again passes through a number of standing stones and stone circles and ancient sacred sites. So there is a theory that the
I'll find it. I'll be done in a second.
Are some form of energy lines, and that the UFOs are following them almost as radar guidance systems, traveling up and down them.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too. I've heard that the ley lines are actually energy lines that are created by magnetic fields of the Earth, and that for anyone that's traveling from outer space that has the right technology, it actually maps out the energy of the planet. And then there's places where there's more magnetic energy or more energy on the planet where they can stop and refuel and all kinds of crazy stuff I've heard. I don't know if it's true or not, but these are the things that I've heard
Yeah,
throughout these interviews. These are theories, I guess is the best way to put it.
they are theories, and I say the people who believe in UFOs and ley lines say that there is a definite connection in this part of the world, and that's they are sighted flying along them. But I say this, as with all things, there's always alternative explanations for it. One of the other odd areas is because it's limestone, you get a situation with limestone where you get underwater rivers where the waters are running in an aquifer, um, dozens, sometimes hundreds of feet beneath the ground, and they're running all the time. But when there are very heavy rains and floods, then the aquifers fill up and the water bursts out onto the surface and follows previously dried up river valleys. And there's a river that runs through this area called the Gypsy Race. That's gypsy as in gypsum, the form of limestone. And it's known as the Waters of Woe because it's said that whenever it's flowed, it's been coinciding with a disaster. Um, and there's all manner of disasters: the Great Fire of London, King Charles getting his head cut off, the start of the First World War, the start of the Second World War, and so on. And I've no doubt in a few years' time, people will be saying that it also flowed when COVID first started in 2020. But that's a continuing legend. And again, interestingly, if you look at these tales of medieval chroniclers, again, going way, way back, they still called it the Waters of Woe then. So it's a long established bit of folklore that when this river appears above the surface and starts flowing, it means bad news. So I think that's actually one of the secrets to the whole area, why it was so important to people in ancient times, because they didn't understand what this river was. We now know about geology and how water flows, but for the people of the time, it would have been a miraculous sensation that supposedly dry riverbeds suddenly are flowing with water that comes from nowhere, doesn't come from the skies, it comes out of the ground and sweeps down and causes chaos. And indeed, even in recent times, when the river has flowed, it's caused flooding and washed away houses and things of that nature. So I think that's it's all what I say adds up to a weird place to be.
I sure wouldn't want to be over there. That sounds like it's got way too much going on. Way too much going on in one area. All right, Charles, we're running up to the end of this interview. Let's do this. Let's run through the important places that people need to go to get your product, to read your books, how they can follow you on your next set of interviews. Because I saw on your website you got a bunch of interviews lined up. How do they find you, and how do they get in contact with you?
Right. My website is www.urbanfantasist, FANTASIST, urbanfantasist.com. And on there, you'll have all the lists of all the interviews I'm doing, also where you can buy all my books. I've got two now in the Haunted Landscapes series, one called Shuckland, which is about where I live now, which takes its name from Black Shuck, a legendary hellhound that appeared in the 16th century and ran through a church killing people in a flash of lightning. and the other one is the mysterious Wool-Newton triangle. And you can buy all of those on Amazon in both print and digital formats. And you can find me on social media at Urban Fantasist. And my email address is on the website, and I'm always happy to talk to people and exchange views and ideas. I'm very much of the view I don't know a fraction of what there is out there, and the more I investigate, the more I realize the world's a lot more mysterious than we think, and that I'm only scratching the surface. So I'm always interested in exchanging ideas and hearing new thoughts from other people.
Well, I'm pretty sure people are going to reach out to you. The Dark Waters family, the Dark Waters Network, focuses on eyewitness encounters, and it's amazing. People will come on and do an interview, and they'd be like, "Man, I had like 15 people contact me about encounters in my area." I'm like, "Yeah, that's what this brand does. We talk to people and focus on encounters." So, ladies and gentlemen, if you are anywhere in the vicinity of where Charles is and you have an encounter, reach out to him and share it with him, because I want you guys to understand the way we glean information is from talking to you and going through historical documents. And that's the only way we get these pieces to this puzzle to put them together. And once we put the pieces to the puzzle together, we turn around and come back and start presenting things to you, ladies and gentlemen, so you can have that knowledge as well. With that being said, Charles, man, I really appreciate you joining me. I'm going to have you back on to talk about your area that you're in, because I want to know more about the hellhound. In New Orleans, where I'm at, hellhounds we are known to have hellhounds. There were hellhounds that people were talking about after Hurricane Katrina, just roaming up and down the street. And I really want to know about the original legend of the hellhound and where it came from, and see if we can make some comparisons. And I actually might try and I think I should be able to get that police officer who saw the hellhound after Hurricane Katrina. I should be able to record him talking to me and let you hear it before our conversation. Yeah, I think I can do that for sure.
That'd be excellent.
All right, Charles, thanks for joining me, my brother. It's good talking to you, and I'll have you back on again soon.
Thank you, James. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.